Ch.A2, Land of the Tender, Body of Gold hard pressed against desire 3. Lian swiftly covered his mouth the moment the sound leaked. That young soldier whipped around. Your Highness. With one hand supporting himself off the ground, Lian used the other to cover his mouth doggedly, his breathing erratic, his shoulders shaking. Just by listening to him and seeing his silhouette, one would probably think he was sobbing. Never in his life, before and after ascension, had Lian experienced such a grueling ordeal. This was much more arduous than the toughest trial at the Royal Holy Pavilion. The strength of the arm supporting his weight drained, and his body keeled over to the side. As he laid on the ground delirious and barely conscious, he saw that boy looked as if he wanted to enter. Lian shouted, "Don't come in." "I said don't come in no matter what you hear!" Exclamation mark. Exclamation mark. That boy stopped in his step, and Lian laboriously flipped onto his back, facing up, and somehow regulated his breathing despite wave after waves of heat crashing through every part of his body. The flower demons outside the cave heard him tossing and turning, that fire burning intensely, and they clapped while laughing. "My good Highness, why be so hard on yourself? Today you're refusing yourself a good time because you're scared of losing followers. Tomorrow you'll be scared to do other things because you'd be scared of losing followers. How is that any way for a heavenly official to live? More like a prisoner, hands tied by those devotees. It's not worth it being a god like that. You're gonna lose your place sooner or later, so why not just enjoy yourself for now? Things come and go, no need to mind the petty details." Veins popped on Lian's forehead and he lost control of his temper. "Shut up!" Exclamation mark. Exclamation mark. He shouted. Outraged. The flower demons naturally weren't afraid of him right now, and they started teasing that little soldier. "You little Didi, don't you think we're right? Ha 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 ha. He, aren't you feeling miserable standing there?" Cold sweat had already drenched his entire body. Feeling exceedingly hot and bothered, Lian violently tore at his robes, wanting even just a sliver of coolness. As he ripped, he suddenly noticed how come strength was returning to his arms. Although that bit of power didn't last long and left just as quickly. When he checked himself, sure enough, the numbness had passed, and energy was gradually increasing. Yet, Lian's heart was dropping. The effect of the tender fragrance was numbness at first, followed by mania. The numbness had passed. So in a moment, madness and passion would fill his veins. Although he drew 2 lines of barriers at the entrance of the cave, the interior one drawn especially to prevent his crazed self from going out once mania took over, he was not certain whether the barrier would be enough to stop him. This moment of clarity was a rare blessing, and Lian grabbed onto it with both hands, thinking rapidly of ways to handle the situation. Suddenly, a small realization came to him. The tender fragrance worked rapidly, usually the moment blood rushed to the brain all control would be lost, so how had he managed to stay afloat until now? Was there no other reason than his exceptional steadiness of the mind? Thinking of this, Lian inhaled a long breath and inclined his head, then he called to the silhouette of
That boy by the cave's entrance, still looking indecisive over entering.
You come in. Hearing his call, that young soldier appeared to want to run to his side immediately, but after a few steps,
he seemed to remember Si Lian's angry instruction of, "Don't come in no matter what you hear," and he
hesitated. Si Lian was also feeling woeful at changing his mind so quickly, and he called again miserably. "Just come in here first." That boy stopped hesitating and rushed in. The tunnel of that cave was long and narrow, the interior warm and humid. Darkness filled the space, not even raised fingers could be seen. That boy used Si Lian's rasping breaths to find where he was. Si Lian then instructed, "Put down your sword, put it on the ground. Right next to me. Not too far away." "Yes, sir." That young soldier acknowledged, and handed over his only defense. He placed it where Si Lian could easily reach for it. Si Lian then added, "Please help me up." That boy half knelt next to him and extended both his arms to help support Si Lian. However, the moment his hands reached out, what he touched wasn't fabric, but feverish skin.
Those hands immediately shrank back.
Si Lian himself felt burned by that boy's hot hands, and only then did he remember he tore off his upper robes earlier in the midst of madness. Men naked from the waist up usually didn't mean anything, except under the current circumstances, it was a little more awkward. But there was no need to highlight that awkwardness, they just needed to do what they must. That boy
seemed to realize it too, and he didn't wait for Si Lian to say anything before he reached out again.
Circling his arm around Si Lian's bare shoulders to help him up, he then immediately let go.
Si Lian
leaned against the wall of the tunnel, with his back pressed against the cool rock. He felt some relief.
Noticing that the other had backed away a few steps, he hurriedly said, "Wait, don't go out yet."
That young soldier heeded his every word, and immediately halted. "Cut off a lock of my hair. I have a need for it," Si Lian said. That boy acknowledged the order and reached out again. However, nothing could be seen clearly in the darkness, and Si Lian's long locks were cleanly tied behind his back, so his first contact wasn't Si Lian's hair.
Instead he accidentally felt the skin of Si Lian's chest, soft and supple with a sheen of glistening
sweat. Si Lian was already in torment, and that boy had touched somewhere sensitive. It was as if a jolt of electricity shocked through his torso, spreading pleasure throughout his whole body, and he moaned
softly.
The two in the cave instantly froze. The flower demons outside the cave were desperately trying to listen in, so how could they miss it? They giggled.
"My gosh, what are they doing in there? So embarrassing."
I daren't listen.
Listening to their teasing of his suffering, Si Lian gritted his teeth.
"You." That boy immediately dropped his hands at the sound of Si Lian's fury, afraid to make any more contact. Obviously Si Lian wasn't furious at him. In his eyes that little soldier was nothing more than a child. He softened his tone, thinking the boy was probably scared of offending him. He said, "Don't panic, continue. Don't mind them."
That boy croaked, "Yes, sir."
But he did indeed seem to be panicking, feeling everywhere he shouldn't, and every time he found he had touched the wrong place his hands would shrink back. In the end he could only trace his hands up Si Lian's chest to find his hair, flaring unspeakable pleasure and agony in Si Lian. Such misery, Si Lian longed to smash his head against the tunnel wall and just pass out for good. Finally, that boy felt Si Lian's throbbing Adam's apple and sought behind the neck, grasping a lock of hair.
With only a few
strands in his grip, he very carefully cut with the sword.
He said instantly after, "Your Highness, it's done." Another small bout of strength returned to Si Lian just then, and he raised his hand. "Give me your
hand." That boy heeded, and from his hands, Si Lian retrieved those long, thin strands and tied him into a knot.
Onto a random finger of that boy's hand. 14.
That boy was baffled, and he asked with a quivering voice, "Your Highness, what's this?" Si Lian sighed.
"The flower demon's poison is about to enter the second stage.
I need to borrow your sword. If anything wants to harm you later, just raise this hand and it can protect you. Now, leave." A moment later, that young soldier returned to the entrance of the cave.
Those flower demons thus became rowdy again.
Out again. Finally. Blocking us outside like this while you went in yourself. Little buddy, you're not very nice. At that same time, Si Lian could feel more strength surging through his limbs. He sucked in a deep breath, and grabbed the worn sword that the young soldier left behind with his right hand. He steadied his spirit, raised the sword, and made a cut on his left arm. In a flash, it was like the fog had lifted, and his senses refreshed. He knew it. Blood streamed down Si Lian's left arm, but it was like he had finally grasped a lifeline in the midst of that chaos. The fragrance of land of the tender could aggravate one's temper and arouse deep, slumbering urges. Typically, the stronger the repressed urge, the stronger the rebound after taking in the fragrance. As for
what Si Lian repressed deep down, taking lust away, there was only the urge to kill left.
This urge to kill couldn't be in reference to monsters or demons. He had slain much evil in the past, so it
didn't count as any sort of repression.
The target to be killed must be human or a god in order to inflict the sense of transgression. Before entering the cave, Si Lian cut himself in order to draw the arrays, and so blood was spilt.
It was somewhat effective against the tender fragrance because injuring himself was
also a form of inflicting harm. At the end of the day, lust and murder were both extremely aggressive desires, and Si Lian had even heard that some thought the nature of both were one and the same. Then, using himself as proof, there was indeed an alternative method to pass the current trial. Sure of his own reasoning, Si Lian cut another line on his left arm without hesitation, and each cut brought more clarity to his mind.
He was just rejoicing and didn't realize that the tender fragrance was
stirring more evil within his body. When that urge to kill was satisfied, instantly, another wave of pleasure poured through his person.
That sudden surge of pleasure coursed through him from head to toe, easily breaking the wall of defense
he painstakingly built, and by the time Si Lian had realized it, he was already quietly moaning. If it wasn't only him inside the cave, Si Lian wouldn't be able to believe that sound came from him. He shuddered violently and widened his eyes, thinking, this method should have worked, so why would this happen?
He glanced at the sword and suddenly remembered that young soldier had used it to cut down the stems
of those flowers, and had struck the humanoid flower demons. The blade was covered in the sap of those land of the tenders.
He used 20% of his power to make the first cut on his arm, and the same
relieving effect could only be achieved if he used 30% of his power to cut. Wasn't this no different than drinking poison to quench thirst? Madness must have gone to his head, otherwise, he should have already noticed this. Lian cursed himself mentally, but since the act had already been done, he could only rip off a piece of his left sleeve to wipe crazedly at the sword, then tear off his right sleeve to stuff it in his own mouth, biting it down mulishly, and do his best to restrain himself. The damned quiet moans continued to escape through his bitten lips and gritted teeth intermittently. However, voices echo within caves, and every small sound was amplified and reverberated outwards. That boy heeded his instructions and covered his eyes, using only his sense of hearing to work, and his ears became more sensitive. There was no reason to think that he noticed nothing. Unable to hold back any longer, he asked with a quivering voice, "Your Highness." To be in such an unspeakable state was the biggest shame of his life. Lian could hardly imagine what would happen should anyone see him now, and even submerged in darkness he could not tolerate the thought. He yelled, "Don't come in!" Exclamation mark. Exclamation mark. However, that piece of cloth was still stuffed in his mouth, so his command only sounded like muffled whimpering, exceedingly pitiful and wretched. Hearing him, that young soldier became even more agitated. Next chapter. Ch.83, Land of the Tender, body of gold hard pressed against desire 4. Lian's left arm was bleeding profusely from the gash he'd created on himself, but at the end of the day, it was only self-harm, not murder, and so the urge wasn't fully fulfilled. His mouth slackened and that stuffed piece of cloth fell from his lips. Lian became more aggressive, and stabbed his left leg. It was a deep cut. The sound of the blade penetrating his flesh was clear. That young soldier couldn't stand back any more and ran towards him. Hearing his hurried footsteps, Lian backed away in terror. Even when his back was pressed against the wall, he continued to push backwards. No. Don't come near me, don't. The second blood barrier by the entrance of the cave was drawn especially for Lian to bar himself, but it couldn't bar that boy, so he still had a chance to return to safety. But the tender fragrance poison was about to enter the second stage. If that boy approached, Lian could very well end his life right then and there, and spare him no chance of escape. He was terrified he'd kill that child by accident, and could only avoid him. That young soldier heard the terror in his voice and called anxiously, "Your Highness." The urge to kill was boiling in his blood. He raised that worn sword with his shaking hand, and a voice inside his head screamed, "I won't die, I won't die, I won't die!" Exclamation mark. Exclamation mark. The next moment, in a split-second decision, the blade turned. In the darkness, that young soldier could see a cold light flash, and he yelled, "Your Highness!" Exclamation mark. Exclamation mark. The sword had struck, and it penetrated Lian's own stomach, nailing himself dead onto the ground. A sharp pain exploded from his abdomen, spreading throughout his whole body, dispersing the heat. Lian's hands were gripping tightly onto the hilt, his eyes bulging. He choked a cough, a thin thread of blood flowed down from the side of his lips, his breathing stagnated, and he stopped moving. That young soldier was dumbfounded, and fell to his knees next to his body. Just then, there was screeching and shrieking outside the cave. "Whoa! Exclamation mark.
The voices of the flower demons were delicate but shrill, and their shrieks piercing to the ears.
Yet there was another who thundered louder, dominating over all of their cries. "What the hell?" Exclamation mark.
Exclamation mark.
Hearing that angry roar, Si Lian suddenly sucked in a breath anew. "Feng Xin," another muffled voice said, "it's land of the tender. If you don't want to get poisoned, then cover your face." That was of course the Mu King, who already had his face covered. Feng Xin covered his face but then seemed to have seen something, and muffled an angry shout.
"Is that, Your Highness? Your Highness?"
"Fuck. What the fuck?" Exclamation mark. "What's this?" Mu King also let out an "A" and noted, "What a disgraceful sight." But his tone wasn't as angry as Feng Xin's, more like the reaction of having heard someone utter a bad joke. Si Lian laid inside the cave and couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could guess that those flower demons probably showed their naked selves before them, looking highly inappropriate. Feng Xin was cursing uproariously. "Hurry and burn them. Don't let anyone else see." Soon, there was a field of flames and the sound of burning. In that roaring fire, the shrieks and curses of those flower demons gradually disappeared. Make sure to burn thoroughly. That fragrance from those flower demons is poisonous. If there are any leftover seedlings, they'll come back, Mu King said. Si Lian sucked in a breath, waited, then coughed weakly once, but the other two immediately heard his voice and charged to the cave, yelling, "Your Highness, are you in there?" "I'm here," Si Lian called. Even though he tried to steady his voice, it was still weaker than normal. The two of them rushed over but were stopped by the barriers outside the cave's entrance. However, they were very familiar with the arrays drawn by Si Lian and knew how to break them. Feng Xin ignited a palm torch, walked a few steps, and before the deepest of the cave was illuminated, he suddenly called out, "Who's there?" Mu King was alarmed too. "Is there someone else in the cave?" "Don't worry. Just a little soldier," Si Lian said. The two dropped their guard and entered. The bright firelight brightened the entire cave with a warm, orangey glow, and illuminated Si Lian, who laid there on the ground, his long hair strewn about, his robes shredded, and a long sword impaled through his abdomen, nailing him to the ground. The two were horrified by the sight. Feng Xin leaned over. "Who did this?" Exclamation mark. "Me," Si Lian replied. Mu King was aghast. "What happened?" Si Lian shook his head. "I don't want to talk about it. This only happened because there was no other way. Hurry and free me from this." Mu King approached and pulled out the sword with a frown, throwing it to the side with a clang. That young soldier retrieved it. Feng Xin helped Si Lian sit up, covered him with an outer robe, only then did Si Lian finally recount roughly the ghastly night with the land of the tender. "You guys came faster than I expected. Where's Qi Rong?" "Qi Rong got locked up by the king in the palace," Feng Xin said. He's too overbearing in the markets, so. Of course he was an easy target.
But he knew to find us after he got back, so not too bad. So it seemed that as much as Chi Rong despised those two servants, he still acknowledged how competent
they were.
The two had planned to have one stay behind to guard the fortress, but Chi Rong was screaming
and howling with a sword smeared in Si Lian's blood, so they thought the danger might be more than they expected, and decided to both come together in the end. Beezy Hill was thick with the essence of evil,
so it wasn't hard to find, which was why they were so quick in coming.
Although Si Lian possessed an ascended body, normal blades could not hurt his essence, and a jab to himself like this wouldn't kill him. Still, he had never really truly lost in a battle of life and death in his 20 years. This was the very first time he had gotten so heavily wounded, so he needed time to recover. And Sir Feng Xin carried him on his back on their return to the royal capital.
Foreign pain stabbed at him
from his stomach, making Si Lian furrow his brows, but he tried to control himself. Did you guys bump into anything on your way here? No, Mu King replied. Si Lian sucked in a breath and said, be careful, there are inhuman creatures about. He had wanted to tell them about that white-clothed being, but because he was really quite exhausted, and seeing from the peripheral of his vision that young soldier following behind with that bloody steel sword in hand, he finally relaxed, closed his eyes to restore his energy, and fell deeply asleep. Since he had capriciously descended into the mortal realm, Si Lian had not closed his eyes to rest for over a month. With stacking pressure growing, this whole ordeal finally crushed him, and he was comatose for 3 whole days. After 3 days he woke with a start and found himself inside his bedchamber. The ceiling above was glamorous and beautiful, it was the palace, and he immediately sat up.
Feng Xin
Was just outside testing his bow, and entered when he heard the call.
Your Highness.
Si Lian's stomach injury had long since healed, and he immediately jumped off the bed. Was I knocked out for a long time? Did anything happen?
Relax, Feng Xin said.
It was only a few days.
There were no enemy attacks. If there were, wouldn't I
have already woken you up?
Go back to bed, you forgot your shoes again.
Calmed, Si Lian went back to bed. After a pause, he asked, where's Mu King? Just then, Mu King walked in too, holding the prepared robes in his hands.
Here.
He attended to dressing the crown prince, and Feng Xin spoke up beside them. However, even though we didn't battle in the past few days, we did find something out. Find out what?
Si Lian asked.
Didn't we say before that there's something off with Yong'an? That there might be reinforcements? We went to scout Beezy Hill and saw several people that were dressed like our citizens, but had a weird accent. They didn't look like they were from Xianlei. I captured them, and sure enough, there are other kingdoms supporting them from the shadows, secretly shipping supplies and arms.
Otherwise, with so many people of Yong'an squished on a barren hill, there was no way they could support
themselves until now, surviving on wild roots and weeds. Feng Xin cussed. Fucking fakers pretending to be all friendly, gotta stir shit up now, hoping Xianlei would fall completely into chaos. The kingdom of Xianlei possessed a vast territory with bountiful resources, its wealth abundant, its production of precious jewels plentiful, and the nearby kingdoms had long watched with eyes green with envy.
Si Lian had expected this and shook his head gravely.
He recalled something else, and asked, "Where's that child?"
Which one?
Feng Xin asked. "Oh, that little soldier. We were rushing you to the Guoxi that day, no one cared for him, he probably went back to his troop." Pressed, Si Lian lowered his arms and sat down with poise on the bed. "That child was pretty skilled, I think he's got really good potential with the saber. If he's taught well, he'd definitely be spectacular when
he's older."
New King, remember to find him for me when you get a chance.
Settle him well.
He could be appointed.
Si Lian was someone who loved those who were skilled in martial arts, and just had to appoint him to his side just so he could watch them every day and soak in delight.
This wasn't the first time he had made such a comment, but it was the first time it was directed to a child.
Liu King heard him make those, really good potential with the saber, spectacular when he's older, remarks, and his expression turned
unreadable. He scrunched up the hairband he'd just untied from Si Lian in his hand, and turned around to throw it to the side. Feng Xin, on the other hand, remarked, "That brat only looked to be about 14 or 15, isn't that too young? What's he gonna do after getting appointed?" New King spoke up too in a flat voice, "It's not proper. It'd be against military rule. A god can descend into the mortal realm, so what can military rule do to me?" Si Lian said then. Praised, "You guys should have seen the way he killed those Binu. It was so good." Speaking of Binu, that strange white-clothed being flashed before his mind. "Your Highness, why have demons like those Land of the Tenders appeared on Bizi Hill? That's never happened before,"
Feng Xin said. Si Lian rose to his feet.
"That's what I wanted to tell you guys that day."
Finally free, he recounted his meeting with that one who bore the crying smiling mask.
The three of them talked it over, but didn't dare to be negligent. They decided in the end that it was better to report it to the heavens. Thus, once Si Lian left his bedchamber, he briefly met with the king and the queen before hurrying to the great martial hall on Mount Taikang. If this was the past, Si Lian would have gone to the heavenly court directly to tell Jun Wu face to face. Yet the circumstances had changed. He was the one who deserted the heavenly court, and that was like handing the keys back. Even if he wanted to go back, the doors would be locked. Plus, he'd left with such upset and spoke with such friction in the great martial hall, that he was a little embarrassed to face Jun Wu. Thus, with great reverence, he lit a few giant sticks of incense in the great martial hall, and passed on the message to the divine statue of the heavenly martial emperor, hoping that he would hear it. However, the number of incense respects Jun Wu received were at least 8,000 to 10,000. An overwhelming amount, with a number of big believers mixed in. Whether he would really hear his message would depend entirely on chance. Si Lian didn't dare leave things be for too long either, and immediately returned to the battlefront to continue his watch over the fortress city. Maybe it was because the damage inflicted in the first battle was too great and their reinforcements had been cut off secretly by Feng Xin and Mu King, but Yonggan seemed to have changed tactics and didn't recklessly attack again. After a few months, they fought a few small battles, but didn't lose too gravely.
Compared to the first battle, those bouts were nothing.
That strange white-clothed being didn't appear again either. Thus, the royal capital of Xianlei was growing slack, and Si Lian himself found a rare chance to leave from the front lines, strolling through the royal capital to relax a bit.
He stepped onto a small stone bridge, stirring long twines of the weeping willow next to the bridge. He
watched lively, red koi fish swish their tails, swimming happily through the coursing waters below, feeling
envious. He was lost in thought for a while when suddenly he felt eyes staring at him from behind, and when he turned his head, there was no one there.
Puzzled, but not sensing any malintent or killing intent, Si Lian didn't mind.
After crossing the bridge, he strolled along the martial deity avenue, and passers-by on the road bowed to
him excitedly or reverently or delightfully, greeting, Your Highness.
Si Lian nodded and smiled, and
after walking for a while, he felt that staring gaze on his back again. This time, he took it to heart, and whipped around without warning, catching the culprit. Behind a willow tree there was a flash of a shadow. Si Lian walked up and was about to grab at the person when he realized with a start that it was that boy with his head wrapped in bandages. Even with bandages wrapped all over his head, that boy still raised crossed arms to cover his face, leaving only a bright eye peeking through his patched sleeves. He stammered, Why, Your Highness, I didn't mean to. Si Lian pointed at him. You're from that night. He trailed off, recalling immediately what exactly transpired that night many months ago, and just how discomposed he was. Images filled his mind and he reddened, feeling slightly awkward, and hurriedly cleared his throat. So it was you. I was going to look for you a while back, but with so much on my plate I'd forgotten.
Ahem.
Aren't you a soldier in the army? Why are you in the city? Hearing him, that boy was taken aback and replied, a little mopingly, I'm not in the army anymore. Si Lian was bewildered. Ha! Why not?
That boy was even more bewildered.
I got kicked out.
Your Highness, did you not know?
Exclamation mark.
Si Lian was perplexed. Know what?
He had clearly told Mu King that that child was a good sprout, to be settled and appointed, so how did he
get kicked out of the army after Si Lian's specific instructions?
That boy looked to be both excited and happy, immediately dropping his arms. So Your Highness hadn't known. I thought. Si Lian was becoming more and more curious.
Come, tell me, why did you get kicked out?
Who kicked
you out?
Why did you think I would know? Also, what had you thought? That boy made a giant step towards him, but before he could speak, just then from the martial deity avenue came a loud, horrified scream.
A-H-H-H-H-H-H-H.
Exclamation mark. Exclamation mark. Si Lian whipped his head around and saw a man holding his face, running and stumbling in his direction.